Yo, what's up? All right, now we are going to be starting Leviticus, and I know what some of you might be thinking. It's going to be boring and repetitive, and you're fucking right, but we're going to power through it anyway because there's stuff to learn. Yo, what's up? Welcome back to my one-year read through the Bible, what I'm calling the Apostate's Bible read-through, or the post-evangelical. I've had some friends hit me up that I knew from back in the day that I was studying with that were kind of like, apostate, are you using that word that like for inflammatory purposes or just to catch people's attention? Or I had a buddy that was even like, apostate, no thanks, and I really don't care what you call this. The point is that I know that this is going to be a kind of non-evangelical, non-orthodox in a lot of ways reading of the scriptures, and I'm not really concerned about trying to toe any sort of dogmatic or ideological line. We're going to kind of read this and see what we glean from it, and I'm just going to say that I think there are going to be portions that are going to kind of suck. And that brings me to Leviticus, because I'll be honest, the first 7 chapters that I've read through today suck. It's basically laying down the individual minute ordinances about the various different types of offerings that the nation of Israel are going to bring to the priests, who are then going to offer to the Lord. It's grain offerings, sin offerings, peace offerings. So when you violate the law, which if you've been following along, which we kind of saw the beginnings of being laid down in Exodus, and if you violate that, well, then there has to be some sort of restitution for that, right? This is the point of justice, righteousness. Dikaiosune is a word that we're going to come across in the New Testament. It's a Greek term that means righteousness, that has to do with like bringing the world back to rights, you know, kind of like tipping the scale back so that there's a balance again. The word cosmos in ancient Greece refers to like this harmony of the universe. The Apostle Paul talks about in Genesis or in Romans 1 how even kind of like the world is groaning, if you will, like the natural creation, the order is out of whack. We talked about this obviously with the fall and in relation to various other religious and spiritual traditions, cultural traditions, that they kind of similarly sense this idea, right? And so the law is intended as a sort of placeholder. It's a taskmaster. It is a technological method of restitution, of justice, of kind of like evening the scales again. And so a lot of it is quite, for lack of a better word, boring, because it's, I mean, fuck, if you've ever read like legal codes or anything like that, sorry if you're a law scholar, that shit can be kind of boring, right? Just all the ordinances and the sub point ones, point twos. If you do this to the minute detail, then this happens. If you don't do this, then this happens, etc., 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 right? Okay, rambling done. What's going on in Leviticus 1 through 7 primarily that caught my attention were a couple of things. One, again, we see a very clear erection of the Aaronic line as being the ones through whom the Israelites reach God. Now, they aren't at the same level of the divine, but there's something really interesting. God gets the first fruits of the offering, right? He gets the best of the grain offering, the best of the bulls and the rams and whatever else that are given, right? The turtle doves, etc., etc., etc. He gets the best of them, but the Aaronic line, the priests, they get the kind of leftovers of that. And that's actually, I think, really important, because there's a sense in which that actually heightens how much they're set apart, their holiness. They may not get the first fruits. Of course, God is the most supreme and the most holy, but nevertheless, they still get a very nice portion of that which is offered by the Israelites, basically elevating them to a status of a type of supremacy, a type of leadership over the Israelites. We've seen this a lot. I probably talked about it to death during Exodus, but this book is called Leviticus. It is going to really explain the Levitical order quite a bit more in detail, so I think it's really important to maybe hammer this point home. So forgive me, I will be a bit repetitive about this probably moving through. One of the other most interesting things that I thought was really important that I could probably linger on a little bit, but I'm just going to kind of throw it out there, because again, this is just kind of like quick hits, and you guys can ponder and think and do more research, but something that's said about the offerings that are offered to Yahweh, to the Lord, right? And when you see in the Bible, for those of you that aren't familiar, if you see capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, that's actually the name of God, Yahweh, Y-H-W-H, because it is a grave error to say the name of God. Like even Yahweh, Jehovah, Yuvha, Vuvha, I guess is how you would say it. I think in Hebrew, my Israeli friends, you can correct me. Even that is an abbreviation, right? And even that is suspect. for certain people to say. A lot of times you'll see actually contemporary Orthodox Jews, they won't even write G-O-D, they'll write G-D, because even that is, they're very careful about making sure that they don't just take the Lord's name in vain, which means just using it meaninglessly, using it for nasty purposes, like when you use it as an exclamation or as some sort of like curse word, but also even just saying the word. This offering that is offered to capital O, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, is something that is a pleasing aroma to the Lord, and it's a desirable food source almost. And this isn't too much of commentary. It actually says that it is a type of food offering to the Lord, and that the aroma is pleasing. And I think there's something so important about this. It makes me think of Marcel Mauss, who is a sociologist of religion, he wrote his dissertation actually is called On Prayer, and we don't need to go too much into this because prayer is quite different, but I think one of the things that's so important to understand is how much the system of an offering is an institution. It's something that's instituted as a social activity. It's not really an individual activity. Sure, there's an individual element if an individual sins, or if an individual has some sort of created some sort of grievance or issue, then that person has to seek restitution somehow. But nevertheless, it's eminently concerned with the social aspect, that this is a kind of a cohesive set of practices that are institutionalized, that derive from institutional order, and then that reaffirm in the offering that same institutional order. So there's both like a top-down and a bottom-up, and they kind of meet in, let's say, this productive type of tension. And so there's a sense in which it's really important to understand how this is a social activity, and then similarly to understand how God himself is constituted through this institutional practice. So there's a sense in which, and I don't know how far we want to take this, but there's a sense in which God himself is constituted. God himself is created, constructed, upheld through the institutional practices. Similarly, the Israelites, as defined as the people of Yahweh, are constituted through their obedience to the sacrificial system. So there's this mutual constitutive relationship, right? They constitute each other. By their practices, they constitute Yahweh as being this particular Yahweh, and vice versa. Yahweh's laws, or the dictates as being followed, constitute the Israelites as being this particular set of people because they follow this particular set of practices. Does that make sense? I think that's really interesting to consider because it demonstrates how there's like this reciprocal relationship. Almost maybe we could even say at the level of being itself. I don't know how far we want to take this. We could say that God, Yahweh, wouldn't exist without these practices, and then we can definitely say that the Israelites wouldn't exist without these practices. So some people wouldn't like that because that seems to then indicate that God's being, his own essence, is dependent, and therefore he is not necessary, and that he is not therefore a perfect being. But the thing that's really interesting is we have to look at the sacrificial system as being a system of sustenance for God. It sustains God as being God. And so I think there's something really kind of interesting here in this intentional declaration that these food offerings are a pleasing aroma to the Lord. So there is a sense of sustenance, there's a sense in which God is pleased, God enjoys this, and maybe that there's this like co-constitutive relationship going on. And then the last thing I want to just briefly say is that there is some mention of when, like for example, a bull is being sacrificed, that the dung and that certain elements of the intestines and the skin and certain elements that aren't desirable or valuable for the sacrifice and then for the meal, the Aaronic meal, that those parts are taken outside of the camp. Remember, they don't have a city yet, so they don't have a temple at this point. They're talking about the tabernacle that is this temporary encampment that they use while they're this diasporic community wandering around the desert. And so they take all of this stuff and they bring it outside the encampment and they burn it in a trash heap. And why that's important is because this trash heap will come to be known once they do have a temple in the Second Temple rabbinic era as Gehenna. And Gehenna is the trash heap that is outside of the city where all the excess, the excrement, the dung, the stuff that isn't desirable, the unclean stuff is taken outside and burned. And it's important because sometimes the word Gehenna is used interchangeably to speak of hell, as this idea of something that is completely removed from the Holy of Holies, which is inside the community. And here's what's so important about this. This means that this gives us a depiction of hell and of holiness, which we might call heaven, not as being these like spheres like above and below the material world. That's a very different sort of spatialization of what's going on here, but rather it's a horizontal element. It's within the community and outside the community. The unclean is outside the community, and the clean is inside, with varying degrees of cleanness that ultimately culminate in the Holy of Holies, where God meets through the appropriate sacrificial system in the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. And that's what's so interesting. And I think this is actually one of the fundamental reasons why I have problems with the Orthodox, or let's say the evangelical, and both Protestant and Catholic, and I guess the third would be the Orthodox Church readings of Christianity that tend to exchange this horizontality for a verticality. And we can talk about why this is the case. I think there are philosophical reasons. When Hellenism comes in, Platonism creates this kind of like dualism between the immaterial world and the material world. But that's getting a bit ahead of ourselves. But I do think it's quite interesting to note this idea now. Again, rather than vertical, horizontal, and maybe even circular, you have the encampment, the most holy place, and then you have the trash heap that's outside. Okay, so that's Leviticus 1 through 7. We're probably going to take this in bigger chunks just because most of these are they're organized in kind of simple categories in larger chunks. I'm going to proceed slowly, and I'm going to keep doing what I'm supposed to be doing because I also don't want to shirk on my responsibilities that I have made to myself, and I guess now to you motherfuckers. But anyway, we'll see how it goes. Another video either tomorrow or the next day where I'll handle another chunk of Leviticus. Like, subscribe, share, get all your friends involved. Peace.